Binge the full week ad-free over at patreon.com/inspireddisorder.
What you manifest in your mind, you can bring to reality.
This is my top 5 podcasts of all time. I've been a fan of podcasts since, I've watched my first podcast called The Broken back in 2003, let's say. But I didn't really get into podcasts till about 2007 and started producing my own podcasts around 2009 and have been doing it ever since. I love podcasts. I've subscribed to hundreds of them over the years. So this is my top 5 list of podcasts that I've enjoyed over my experience, my decade plus experience following many podcasts. These are the ones that stood out to me the most. Not all of these podcasts are still around, but they are still featured. Some are still featured on this list, and some of these on the list are still going. So let's get into it, shall we, with my top 5 podcasts of all time, starting with number 5. Starting with number 5 is Your Mom's House podcast, hosted by Tom Segura, Christina Pazitsky. They are 2 stand-up comedians. This is a show that has been going on and has grown from starting off with Red Band in a spare bedroom of his house. And now Your Mom's House has studios. They are moving to Austin. They are producing other podcasts. But the show, Your Mom's House, is a hilarious podcast where Christina and Tom talk about a lot of internet memes. They're one of the first podcasts to really feature kind of obscure internet, popular internet videos or unpopular internet videos. They brought a lot of classic characters to the table. They also feature a ton of fan-related creations. The music that their fans create are some of just the most amazing songs, using clips from videos that they feature, as well as sound bites from the podcast itself. So it's a podcast that has grown so much, that's one of the aspects I love about podcasts. If you're a podcast that has grown and evolved over time and gotten better, that is something that I really enjoy. And Your Mom's House is one that I do not miss, have not missed a week of, and really enjoy every minute of it, including their live uncensored versions, which are amazing as well. The heavy segments are brutal and have caused a lot of trauma in my life, but I enjoy every traumatic moment. So next up, moving on to my number 4 podcast of all time, is the podcast All Fantasy Everything, hosted by Ian Carmel, regular co-hosts Sean Jordan and David Bory, as well as usually they have a guest on as well, a guest comedian on as well. And what they do on All Fantasy Everything is they draft things. They draft ideas. It's an inspiration for this show. Top 5 was inspired by All Fantasy Everything. They basically, so it's 4 people usually. Sometimes it's 3. I believe sometimes it's 5. Each person will take a turn drafting a thing. Let's just say an episode, which I talked about yesterday, was an episode where they drafted Taco Bell menu items. They've also drafted things like the mall, just kind of open ideas of the mall, and you can draft anything. And they take turns. It's serpentine style, so it goes from the person who picks first in the first round will pick fourth in the second round, and then it goes through, and it's hilarious. First off, the rapport that everybody has. They're all stand-up comedians. They're all like wholesome comedians too. They're hilarious. Ian Carmel is one of the writers and also on-screen personalities for the Late Late Show with James Corden. I love it so much. It makes me feel so happy. Sean Jordan has the most biggest heart of anybody. He gets super emotional in so many episodes, and he's just so thankful for everything. I love it so much. It's a show with a lot of heart. It's also a show where they get really creative with their picks, and they make it really fun. And it is a show that I have re-listened to, gone back through the entire library. I'm currently listening to from episode 1 to catching up to wherever they are now. And it's a show that I can re-listen to over and over again. And there's regular bits in the show that have been fun to re-explore as I've gone through the entire library again, which is a lot of fun. But coming in at number 4 is All Fantasy Everything. Number 3, my number 3 podcast of all time is a podcast that is no longer around, but it is the podcast that inspired me to do my first experimental podcast, which was in 2007, 2008, which I only did 5 or 6 episodes of, called The Billy Dallas Show. That show was inspired by the Totally Rad Show, which is a video podcast produced by Revision 3, one of the first podcast networks that started back in like 2004 or something like that. I started watching in 2007-ish. I first started watching Dignation with Alex Albrecht and Kevin Rose. Alex Albrecht was on this other podcast called Totally Rad Show with 2 of his friends named Dan Trachtenberg and Jeff Kanata. And it is a show where they talked about different things. For instance, they would review movies. They would talk about video games. Sometimes they would talk about comic books. Sometimes they would do fun reviews of board games, or they would go on little adventures. But it is a show that I loved. It is a show that was that introduced me to a lot of other shows. It was a show that inspired me to start podcasting, or at least attempt a video show, very early on. And it's a show where one of the members, Jeff Kanata, is still podcasting, and there's a podcast that I listen to with him that may come up later. Jeff Kanata is it's weird how somebody has, kind of stayed with my podcast journey over the years, going from TRS to another podcast, which I still listen to, which I will talk about. But it's just a really fun show. It's a show that also inspired the Ultimate Movie Championship. They had a segment on TRS where they played a game called Versus using Flickchart, which is the same website that I use, that Keith and I use for the Ultimate Movie Championship, where the 3 of them were given 2 movies, and they had to argue over which of those movies is the better movie, which when you have 3 people arguing over movies, it tends to be a lot more dramatic, because sometimes somebody has to play the tiebreaker. And you also get to see it's a really fun show. You can find old episodes of Totally Rad Show on YouTube still, I think. I don't know if they're all there. I wish they were. I wish there was a suppository or a repository. I don't know what it's called. I wish there was an archive of Totally Rad Show somewhere where I could go back and watch all those old episodes. But just so much fun. Totally Rad Show, production quality, video editing quality, because it was primarily a video podcast, way before YouTube was even around, by the way. The FBI shut down Revision 3 at one point because they were distributing all their video podcasts using torrents, and the FBI was very curious because there was a lot of torrent traffic coming out, and they thought they were part of some kind of, pirating situation. Which was a fun time. It's very early on in podcasts. This was like many, many years before anybody knew what podcasts were. Way before Serial was even a thing. But yeah, Totally Rad Show coming in at number 3 of my podcast of all time. My second podcast of all time. This is my second favorite podcast in existence. There are no other podcasts, aside from one other ones, that's better than this one, in my opinion. And it is the first podcast that I subscribed to that was audio only. And it was a podcast that was recommended by one of the members of the Totally Rad Show, Dan Trachtenberg, who is the director of 12 Cloverfield Lane. Dan Trachtenberg was a guest on this show and recommended it. And so I became a subscriber to my first audio podcast. And that podcast is coming in at number 2. My second favorite podcast of all time is the Slash Filmcast. This is a podcast that is currently hosted by David Chen, co-hosted by Devendra Hardawar, and also co-hosted by Jeff Kanata, who at one point was the third member of the Totally Rad Show. So Jeff Kanata coming in at my number 3 and my number 2 podcast of all time. The Slash Filmcast talks about movies that they've watched throughout the week and ends each episode with an in-depth review of whatever popular new release has been out. They have the most in-depth, knowledgeable, articulate conversations about films that I have seen in any podcast. Their opinions vary. There are days where I agree with each of them separately or all together. Some of them will never cease to amaze on what every once in a while there'll be just a movie that is a steaming pile of crap that someone in that show will absolutely love and defend, and it is painful at times to watch. But this is the show, the Slash Filmcast, is the show that inspired me to start podcasting for real. David Chen posted a blog early on, about 2008, describing his production setup for recording. Both of his co-hosts at the time were located and are still located at different parts of the country, so everything was done remotely. This is way before Zoom was a thing, and he listed all of the software and hardware that he used to produce the Slash Filmcast, and I followed that to the letter to start producing my first longest-running podcast, the Inspired Disorder podcast. I started that in 2009, late 2009, and that was 100% inspired by the Slash Filmcast. I even copied the format, how he introed and exited the podcast. Everything to the line was a copy of the Slash Filmcast, except for what we talked about. We talked about art and geek culture, so kind of an open-ended podcast that I did with 2 of my friends. But that podcast was inspired 100% by the Slash Filmcast. I'm currently a Slash Filmcast Patreon member, which it's an honor to be a supporter of those 3 dudes. It's a show that has it's amazing. It's a great show. I love it so much, and I've had the pleasure of being able to communicate back and forth with all 3 of these guys at different points in their podcasting journeys, as well as mine. So that's my number 2. Coming in number 2, my second favorite podcast of all time is the Slash Filmcast. But my number 1 podcast of all time is a podcast that's no longer around, is no longer being produced. It's a podcast that's not even it's not easy to get. You have to download basically, I don't know if it would be illegal, but the podcast isn't available anywhere except for torrent. You can find, and I guess there's some websites that may stream old audio episodes, but it was an audio and video podcast hosted by the one of the wealthiest artists in the world, David Cho, and co-hosted by one of the most popular porn stars, Asa Akira, and they had tons of co-hosts throughout each episode, tons of fun guests throughout each episode. It is a podcast that evolved quite a bit throughout its run. I think maybe there were 200 episodes in total throughout the DVD ASA run. David Cho, the host of the show, the famous artist, had gotten in trouble, gotten himself in trouble multiple times for saying extremely outlandish, crazy things on the show. Every episode, it seemed like David Cho was doing everything possible to get canceled in a time before canceling was as popular as it is now. But he's a guy that can't really get canceled because he's an artist. He's independent. Now, as far as going to jail for saying some outlandish shit, that could be fabricating some of the stories that he fabricated were the fact that they were fictional stories are pretty much the only thing that would probably kept him from going to jail. I don't know, but it is definitely one of the freest podcasts I've listened to. It is one of the most dangerous, quote unquote, dangerous podcasts I've listened to. And it's a show that visually evolved over its run to where it ended up, it basically, David Show created a studio that was just a giant padded room, and then all of the guests that would come in would have headsets on, and they would be, wearing all white, kind of like almost, gowns that you would wear in an institution of sorts. So visually it changed quite a bit. It's a visual style that carried on to other podcasts like Tiger Belly, as well as, I think, Bloodbath is produced. No, I think Tiger Belly, because they had DVD ASA had like the different. It almost looked like security camera footage where it had all of the camera feeds going at once, which really lended itself to when the studio turned into a padded room. But yeah, it's a show that I loved. It was a show that inspired me in a lot of ways. It inspired me as a podcaster. It inspired me as an artist. There are things that David Show talked about and advice that he gave that I apply to my life to this day. There's this great quote in an episode he did while he was in Big Bears, kind of one of his secluded episodes where he was by himself and just talking about what it is to be an artist and what it is to be successful and how you have to leave everything behind. And there's a scene from the movie. God, what's that movie? I'm gonna blank on it. It's a sci-fi movie, and I'm blanking on the name of it. But there's a scene. It's these two brothers, sci-fi movie, and it's a time in the future where everybody's livelihood is dependent on your DNA. So when you're born, they do a test, and based on your test, that will determine what you do in your life. Kind of like communism in a lot of ways. But there are these two brothers, and one of them is going to be an astronaut, and the other one is not qualified. But then the unqualified one pretends to be the other one, and kind of gets his way into being an astronaut. And there's a scene where they used to compete of swimming out to a buoy and swimming back. And for the longest time, the weaker younger brother could never do it until one day where he realized that he just never left enough energy for the swim back. He just swam across the entire channel. And that's something that David Cho mentions as an artist, that you have to put yourself in a position where you don't have that option to go back to something. You have to burn a bridge. It's the only way to be successful, because it's so hard. It's so hard. It's so easy to give up. And giving up is the only way to guarantee failure. So the only way to give yourself a shot at success is to leave everything behind and try to just swim across to the next step, the next kind of the next area. Anyway, DVD ASA, my favorite podcast of all time. It's a shame that it's no longer out. But you can, if you know how to use the internet, you can find the archives of it, which I've recently discovered and have been listening back through those old episodes, and I've been enjoying it. So, number one, DVD ASA. Let me go through my top 5 podcasts of all time one more time, and we'll get out of here. Number 5 is Your Mom's House. Number 4 is All Fantasy Everything. Number 3 is Totally Rad Show. Number 2 is the Slash Filmcast. And my number 1 podcast of all time is DVD ASA. A few notable mentions, honorable mentions, podcasts that have been really kind of big in my life, but didn't make the list. Doug Loves Movies would have made the list, but the pandemic kind of altered that show in a big way. Kill Tony is a show that I used to watch until politically I couldn't do it anymore. Same with Joe Rogan Experience. Probably watched more episodes. I've listened to Joe Rogan probably more than any other human on planet Earth, but it got to a point where I couldn't listen to him anymore. And the show Dignation, that really kind of spawned everything, my love of podcasts in general. But yeah, and also Getting Dug with High is another show that I really enjoy. Let me know what your favorite podcasts are in the comments or hit me up on social media at Ray Taylor. But those are my top 5 podcasts of all time. Get yourself some amazing coffee from an independent brewer out in Thetford Center, Vermont. That's right. StationHouseCoffee.com is where you go. Follow Station House Coffee on Instagram to get your small batch, single origin, premium coffee. Order it online and get it shipped directly to you. Let them know the Ray Taylor Show sent you. Go over to stationhousecoffee.com today and order yourself some coffee, and follow Station House Coffee on Instagram. New episodes of The Ray Taylor Show come out every single day. Subscribe on IGTV, YouTube, and everywhere else podcasts are found. Binge the full week ad-free over at patreon.com/inspireddisorder. Buy Ray Taylor Show merch over at inspireddisorder.com. Follow the show on Instagram at Ray Taylor Show. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Peace out!